pleased to say we have company on the programme today. In fact, I'm sure it's the biggest number of guests we've ever hosted. And my colleague Rich Ward is producing today. Now, Rich, how many guests at the last count?
It's running into the trillions, Dan.
And did they want coffee?
Just the 1 cup.
I'll introduce those guests to you in a moment because I'm only just getting to know them myself and I already think they're my new best friends. I think they'll become yours as well. If they do, it's likely that friendship will change the way you eat forever. But to get to that point, we've a lot to get through. An encounter with twins, hunting with forest tribes in East Africa, and all with a trip to the White House and a London hospital thrown in.
Dan, don't forget to mention the food.
Oh, yeah. And as this is the food programme, we will, of course, be offering our guests something delicious to eat and drink. So sit back and relax. Come with me on a journey of discovery. You, me, and our trillions of friends. And part of their story starts in the Netherlands 300 years ago, as Nick Lane will explain. That's Dr. Nick Lane.
And I'm an evolutionary biochemist at University College London.
And our guide to one of the world's truly great discoveries, made by a man from the city of Delft. And although most of us don't know his name, we should.
A draper called Antony van Leeuwenhoek.
It's the aftermath of the Anglo-Dutch War. Europe is about to enter a golden age of scientific discovery. In the late 1660s, Van Leeuwenhoek visited London and came across a book with an intriguing title, Micrographia, written by Robert Hooke, a founder of the Royal Society. That book would inspire our Draper hero to design and build a microscope. And years later, in the 1670s,
he did something that nobody else had ever done before. He took some samples of water from a lake, and there were green clouds in this lake, and the green clouds were algae. And beautiful algae, if you look at them down the microscope. Spirogyra is the name of them, and they're beautiful spiral forms. When he looked at the green clouds, he saw things there which he hadn't expected to see. He realised that this was a whole other world, full of extraordinary creatures. This vibrant world of all these strange animals. Some of them seemed to have wheels and things that turned. He was describing things that nobody had ever seen or heard of or imagined.
A hidden universe revealed. And this is how he described it.
Among these streaks, there were besides very many little animalcules. And the motion of most of these animalcules in the water was so swift, so various upwards, downwards and roundabout that 'twas wonderful to see. And I judged that some of these little creatures were above 1,000 times smaller than the smallest ones I have ever yet seen upon the rind of cheese.
Those smallest ones on the rind were cheese mites, which you can just about make out with the naked eye. Fascinated by these animalcules, as he named them, experiments began. And of course, they involved food.
And one of the most interesting ones he did was to add peppercorns to water. Sometimes he ground them up and sometimes he simply added the peppercorns. And he added all kinds of other things as well. He added ginger and cloves and nutmeg and even vinegar. And he would take samples every day of the water to see, are there any animalcules there? And very often at the beginning, there were no animalcules there at all. But after a few days, he would start to see teeming hordes of the tiniest animalcules in the pepper water.
So please let me introduce you to the friends I mentioned earlier.
This was the first discovery of bacteria. It was simply unimaginable that there could be millions of animalcules living in a drop of water or living on your teeth or living in your gut. It was simply one of the most radical discoveries in all of human history.
But, as history shows, it's not easy being a pioneer. In fact, it's a risky business.
He was accused of being drunk and all kinds of things.
But when others were also able to peer into this microbial world, a universe of animalcules, he was vindicated, his legacy secure.
Van Leeuwenhoek is universally acknowledged as the father of microbiology, and he gloried in his discovery of bacteria and his animalcules.
Fast forward 3 centuries and the present day. In fact, just a few weeks ago, this was a big announcement from the White House.
And it's just an absolute pleasure to be here for this event today and a delight to
It's
have
the
so many
launch
you
of
here.
one of President
And,
Obama's
so many
so-called
of you
moonshots, an all-out effort by government and fellow agencies to change our future.
We have Department of Energy, we have NASA, we have and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So we have quite
This particular moonshot involves $120 million of federal money, with many millions more from elsewhere, all dedicated to the research of something called the microbiome.
I wanted to start with a definition of microbiomes. The microbiome is a collection of microorganisms living in a particular habitat.
Which could be on your skin or inside your mouth. Microbiomes, complex communities of microorganisms, are everywhere. This new American initiative will look at them all, but it's the microbes in your gut and mine, the gut microbiome, that we're focusing on here. And just as when Van Leeuwenhoek first glimpsed his animalcules, it represents the opening of a new frontier. So now you've met the microbes, you really need to meet Jeff Leach.
It's only been in the last, within the last decade that the technology has allowed microbiologists to understand really who's there, meaning who's in our body and who's on our body with regards to bacteria and other life forms. And so now computing power as well has allowed researchers to do lots of sampling and deep sampling or sequencing of bacteria on and in people's bodies. And now what people are learning worldwide who are working on this issue is that these microbes and other life forms may be connected in some way or playing even potentially a causal role in some of the big diseases that ail us today.
Jeff Leach would be the first to admit he's not a mainstream thinker. He lives in the Texan desert. He also happens to be the co-founder of the American Gut Project, a serious and internationally respected research effort.
It's not much of a stretch to argue that this collection of microbes, which can weigh several pounds inside of our body, as much as our brain, actually are collectively pulling the levers, if you will, on aspects of our immunity and disease. And so it's now considered a metabolic organ as important as your heart or your liver. So they've become, through eons, intimately connected to who we are, and losing them or impacting them has detrimental effects on us that we're just now trying to understand.
Okay, well, we've made it this far into our story. Now comes another big idea, and it's this. The relationship between your gut microbiome and the food you eat is far more complex and influential to our health and well-being than we ever imagined. I'm also sorry to say that when we reach the end of this edition, I'll have raised more questions than provided answers, simply because this field is so new and moving so quickly. But what do we already know about the effects of our diets on our microbiome? Our guide to that particular story is Tim Spector.
I'm a professor of genetic epidemiology at King's College London, which means studying genetics of big populations to work out what causes disease, and a physician at Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital.
Tim is the author of The Diet Myth, the real science behind what we eat.
And I'm fascinated by gut microbes. It's one of the most exciting times to be studying these microbes. We're just scratching the surface. A microbe is any little organism that you need a microscope to see. In general, we talk about them as bacteria, and there are these other, even older forms like bacteria called archaea. There are viruses, and there are also fungi inside us, quite normally. And we also got lots of other little tiny animals in there as well.
I met up with Tim recently, and as he told me his story, we shared a meal, and it wasn't just for pleasure, as will become clear. There you go.
Lovely. So deliciously creamy blue cheese.
Tim had a serious health scare on holiday about 5 years ago, which eventually left him with increased blood pressure and a future that looked different to the one he'd been expecting.
So suddenly I'd gone from what I thought was a fairly healthy 53-year-old to someone who was taking tablets and was labelled as someone with a heart condition, and realised that I had a father who'd died of a heart attack at 57, and I was suddenly an at-risk middle-aged person.
And so, one of the world's leading epidemiologists began a period of reflection.
Having been a practicing doctor for over 30 years, patients who came to me seeking dietary advice, I generally followed the party line up to about 4 or 5 years ago, which was that fat is bad, that everything's fairly simple, that reducing calories and increasing exercise is the way to lose weight. I didn't really question it much. I did what most doctors do and basically kept up the same dogma because it was much easier that way than having to work it out from scratch.
And so he began a professional and personal mission to get well again and understand how a food experiment got underway. He'd spend years testing different diets, from reducing meat to going completely vegan, and then back to omnivore. Tim reduced salt, tried low-fat foods, and as he ate and monitored his health, he read and reviewed everything he could find on nutrition, years of scientific literature. And it was the decades of advice we'd been given about eating a low-fat diet, the advice that took us into the era of margarine and reduced fat yogurt, that really intrigued him.
None of it made sense to me. All the data seemed to be contradictory, and I said, well, why are all these other studies not really showing any benefit of people who go on low-fat diets? Yes, the rat studies do show short-term changes, and you get short-term change in humans, but actually, when you do trials of real people, you don't get these benefits. And I also came across the world's biggest study on it, comparing a low-fat diet and a high-fat diet, the so-called Predimed study.
Started in Spain in the early 2000s, this study compared low and high-fat variations of the Mediterranean diet. Those placed on the higher fat diet, consuming greater quantities of olive oil, had a lower incidence of heart attack and stroke than those consuming less fat. In fact, so marked was the difference, an ethics committee halted the study in the interests of the low-fat group.
This trial, which has largely been sort of ignored in the UK, really should have blown low-fat out of the water. That, to me, was the key.
And this, of course, takes us into the biggest nutrition row of our times.
New advice that eating fat could help cut obesity and type 2 diabetes is criticised as irresponsible and potentially deadly.
The current and often bitter debate over fat versus carbs as the source of our diet-related woes, including diabetes and obesity, is likely to rage on for some time. But for this particular professor, it misses the point. Something else is missing from this dietary debate.
It's this idea of still demonising one particular food, because we've now just moved from fat to a debate about, OK, maybe it's sugar, but it shouldn't be one or the other. They just seem to shift from one demon to another. Whether it's sugar, whether it's fructose. There has to be a demon rather than looking at the bigger picture.
And the bigger picture, Tim argues, should include the gut microbiome. Luckily, Tim had access to an unusual group of people so that he could research the role of these microbes. He happens to oversee one of the most ambitious health studies underway in the world right now, and it revolves around twins. St Thomas's Hospital in central London is where twins from all over the UK, and in fact the world, turn up to take part in a trial that's now been running for decades.
My research career has really been based around one good idea I had about 23 years ago, which was to start a UK adult twin collection. And this has grown into one of the most unique resources in the world of 10,000 twins that I've been studying for over 20 years that are probably the most studied people on the planet.
They took extra blood this time. But yeah, just height and weight and have a nice cup of tea and a biscuit.
And we wouldn't miss it for the world.
We love doing it.
These twins, like thousands of others, have not only been subjected to an extremely wide range of medical tests, they've provided every sample of bodily matter imaginable. This unique resource gave Tim the opportunity to try and answer a question. Why, despite having the same food, do some twins react so differently? And that's where the microbiome comes in.
Suddenly dawned on me that one of the big reasons that we've lost our way in dietary research is we've just been ignoring this organ inside us, this microbiome that gives us all this amazing individuality and pretty much determines how we react to food and why we're going through this food disaster and this epidemic of ill health related to our poor diet.
For Tim, the confusion and conflict around diet started to fall away when he took a close look at his decades of data. He discovered even identical twins can have vastly different gut microbiomes.
Pretty much everything I looked at
in terms of good and bad diets and our health started to make sense. And even the twin data I had also started to fit this pattern, because identical twins are identical, but they're certainly not identical in terms of their microbes. And I was able to piece apart these different factors, but the common theme kept coming back. Yes, the underriding factor that joins it all up is our gut microbes. Everyone is pretty much unique in terms of their microbiome. We think that we all have some microbes that are perhaps unique to 1 in 50,000 people. We only share about 20% of our microbes with each other on average, which is quite amazing, really, because we share 99.5% of our genes. So we have what is pretty much like a unique microbial fingerprint. And this explains why we all respond differently to foods, why we respond differently to different tastes, and why our health is so variable, and why these sort of standard diets have been so unpredictable to people. There isn't one size fits all.
And since we started working on this program, I've had to rethink yet again what happens when I put food inside my mouth and it starts its journey to become part of me, from chewing and then down, 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 until...
This is the dark, dingy dungeon of the cavernous lower colon. This enormous space that is our large intestine. All these thousands of different microbe species have specific enzymes, chemicals that they release, which are targeted just at breaking down food. As soon as it's there, it will trigger microbes to seek it out and attach to it, and they will do a number of different things to it. There'll be some microbes that will just be digesting it, mining it, if you like, for particular rare nutrients, and there'll be others that will be looking at that food as a source purely of energy. Waste product of one microbe could be the best form of champagne for another microbe. And so there's this whole community of microbes swarming around our food and produce healthy chemicals that keep our immune systems alive and well, keep everything suppressed, stopping allergies, and even provide chemicals that can make us happy or sad. So we're only just touching the tip of what all these chemicals inside our guts can actually do.
And there are some foods they thrive on, foods capable of arriving deep into our digestive system, whereas others don't.
Things that are very digestible fats and refined carbs don't really get to the microbes. So it's starchy vegetables, complex foods that get down to the colon and then encounter the microbes.
Well, Tim, I'm just going to, in this meal that we're sharing, I'm just going to cut a slice of a food that I know both you and I enjoy a lot. And this is a blue cheese. There you go.
Lovely. So deliciously creamy.
Another reason Tim loves blue cheese is the combination of bacteria, including lactobacillus, and fungi found along the blue veins and on the crust of the cheese.
We know very little about fungi, but everything that's pointing to them also being very good for us. It turns out that the French have at least twice as much cheese as we do, and annoyingly for the British have less heart disease and problems.
Here, have some peanuts, Tim.
Yeah, peanuts were probably the first things that I remember as a kid being told were bad for you.
But now, for Tim, along with seeds, they're a valued part of his diet and represent an important source of fibre and something called polyphenols, which microbes really love.
I wouldn't just eat peanuts as a sole bit of diet, but we should go back to having a whole variety of nuts and seeds.
We don't yet understand, perhaps we'll never understand, the complex chemistry that takes place within our microbiome, the chain reaction triggered by the food choices we make, the ingredients we eat, and the work of the microbes we host. But Tim believes there's one dietary suggestion that's hard to dismiss, and you can sum it up by saying, just make it interesting.
We have our unique microbial fingerprint, but what we're realizing is that the key to having good gut health is to have as diverse a number of microbes as possible, and to do that you need as diverse group of foods that they're feeding off as possible. It's that combination of getting diverse food groups inside you that will give you the healthiest, most beneficial microbes.
But before we go any further, we need to make another shift in this story to go from the micro world of our trillions of friends to a macro world of the food we grow across the planet. Because if Tim is right and diversity is one key to our dietary health, we have a problem. In the last half century, the crops we produce and the food we consume have become less and less diverse.
In these last 50 years, there has been a threefold increase of agricultural production.
Alexander Maybeck is a senior advisor within the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, and he's been monitoring the shrinking diversity of food and diets around the world. The Green Revolution of the 60s and 70s saved millions from starvation, and it did that by mainly focusing on rice, wheat, and corn.
And a bit broadly, 3/4 of the total calories consumed in the world are coming from only 12 crops and 5 animal species. And you can compare that to the fact that humans have used more than 7,000 species of plants, and that there are another 70,000 plants which are known to have edible parts.
And so if you walk into a supermarket and feel confronted by endless choice and the appearance of diversity, think again. Behind most processed foods, chemically at least, lies a tiny number of crops.
One example is corn, because it is a raw material used to produce so many items, from biscuits to bread to feed for animals to sugar for sodas. It's typically, most of the time in industrialized countries, you do not eat corn as such, as a piece of corn that you recognize. But it is present in almost all the food that you would buy, hidden under the name of a particular molecule coming from corn.
There are many non-food factors at play which are believed to have reduced the diversity inside our guts, from the rise of caesareans, natural birth being a powerful mechanism for seeding our microbiome, to increased antibiotic use. And so a hunt is underway, the search for our missing microbes.
There's a lot of smart people working with rural and remote populations around the world, from New Guinea to South America and now in Africa.
Jeff Leach is one of the smart people working in different parts of the world, tracking down indigenous peoples who have had little contact with the outside world. In his case, the Hadza, a tribe of less than 1,000 people found in the central Rift Valley.
It's not that we believe that these hunter-gatherers have an ideal diet. What makes them interesting is that they still live in the dirt. They still live in grass huts. The babies are born literally in the dirt. They still, from an evolutionary perspective, hunt the same animals and gather the same plants that humans have for millions of years. So consequently, they're in microbial ground zero.
This story gets even more interesting because Jeff embarked on a risky experiment to rewild his microbiome, to find out more about what the Hadza have that we might have lost. It resulted in him lying on his back with a kitchen implement in hand on the arid East African plains under a baobab tree.
So it was near nightfall, and put my feet in the air, put my hands underneath my hip, and just kind of pedaled an imaginary bicycle and watched the sunset over Lake Eyasi. And I'm thinking to myself, had I just made the most important or biggest mistake of my life?
Don't worry, that will all make sense, because as there's so much more to say on this subject and so much new information coming out, we'll be returning to it after a special programme next week on Brexit and Remain and food. And I'm confident that that edition will provide one of the most interesting and unexpected angles on the debate you'll have heard so far. But in our next instalment on the microbiome, we'll venture to the Amazon to hear the latest thinking on why the seasonal eating habits of another tribe are influencing thinking on our gut microbes.
Cassava is eaten all day long. The food is in great part provided by the jungle, in the most part.
I promise you, it will really open your mind.
Bravo! Aplausos!